and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week, gun violence in Mississippi and the nation as a whole is a plague on our very society. But political solutions seem to be impossible to find given partisan divisions. What can the rest of us do on the community level? We'll hear from criminologist Kevin Lavine, and Cassie Miller with the Southern Poverty Law Center joins us. The discussion's so-called replacement theory. It's been linked to deadly violence as recently as last month. That's all ahead this Sunday morning on Mississippi Insight. The general reaction to the latest mass shootings in America may be summed up simply: we are shocked but not surprised. From Buffalo, New York to Uvalde, Texas, and just last week, Tulsa, Oklahoma. The death tolls are horrible, and Americans are still trying to find ways to prevent new attacks. But it's not only mass shootings that are costing us so dearly. Mississippi, for instance, has the nation's highest rate of homicide overall. That's according to CDC data from 2020, the latest available. The overwhelming majority of those homicides involved firearms, and when you add suicides to the totals, Mississippi also has the worst death rate from firearm injuries. So even as the nation as a whole saw a 35% increase in firearm homicides between 2019 and 2020, Mississippi led the way, straight to the bottom of the list. Professor Kevin Lavine is a criminologist and veteran law enforcement officer in Jackson. He joined my colleague, Melanie Christopher, last week to discuss our rising gun violence and what we might do to curb it.
Professor, your thoughts on the level of violence that we're seeing here in Jackson, but also across the country?
Well, I think the level of violence that we're seeing nationwide, let's put it like that, is at a level that we have, is unprecedented. When I say the level of violence, let's be more specific, the level of violence by our youth. And it should be alarming. We should be in a state of alarm nationwide as to why are we having so many youth turning to violence, the level of violence. And that's something that has to be holistically looked at from every angle: political, social services, community. It should go all the way back down to the household. We have to trace that back to where the source. And let me tell you why: because if you arrest a child and you put them in a situation where you could incarcerate them for a minute or so, and then you release that child, you're releasing them back into that environment that fostered that negative behavior. And as a criminologist, we're trained to look at not just the crime, but what makes that child deviant. And I think law enforcement should merge between academia and law enforcement and try to come up with some solutions that, although might not be popular, but they are what you call empirical, and you can use them in best case practices.
Do you think that the guns themselves, no other place in the world has the gun ownership that we do, and no one else in the world, no other country in the world has the mass shootings that we do?
Correct.
Is there a correlation between how easy it is to get a gun?
Yes, I would say that based on my years of experience working in law enforcement, as long as I have, I've seen it from being on the military police side to the public side. I've never seen anything so profound with youth having these type of weapons in 30 plus years I've done this. And the gun shows, because we have liberal gun laws, it's not per se that 13-year-old that's actually going in there, but they have surrogates that will go in there and purchase those weapons for them, and then that surrogate will sell it at a profit for themselves. It's almost like localized gun running.
You mentioned to one of our reporters last week that youth crime is a huge problem in the community. So what factors do you see behind the trend? You talked a little bit about the family situation. Did the pandemic play a role?
Well, I don't want to really say the pandemic played a role. It was disruptive, and I'm not going to say, and it did have, if you talk to some academics, they would tell you there was some psychological effects on it, but none of that segues into violent crime. Violent crime is a progressive act, going from misdemeanors, and these individuals generally progress on up from misdemeanors into these violent crimes. Very rarely do you find a child that just jumps from, I'm not happy at home, so I'm gonna go buy AR and I'm gonna walk the streets and do the violence that we do. It's some type of, something is going on in that child's immediate social circle, to include the family.
We have heard mental health. You know,
Yes.
we've heard a lot of the lawmakers, both locally and in the national arena, say it's not about guns, it's about mental health. We've never been real good with this mental health thing and finding out what is wrong with these kids. How do we find that out? Why is it always later rather than earlier?
Because it goes back to what I said before. There needs to be a partnership between academics and law enforcement, especially criminologists. Like I said, what we do, we look at the cause. There are some causes that cause a person to be predispositioned. Does not necessarily mean because this child was the child of a crack addict or whatever, that this child, or a sociopath, this child is going to be deviant. We have to go back and look at what are the sociological, biosociological, physiological, in academic, we have a lot of theoretical perspectives that we can give to law enforcement, being myself, that we can look at and say, hey, well, maybe let's look at it this way. Let me use myself as an example. When I was at JPD, I remember 1 month I made over 200 arrests in Precinct 3 alone. And I saw no change in the patterns that were going on in the community. It was not until I got more academically inclined that I started looking at alternative matters or processes to deal with the crime. And my best success came from using those. I cleaned up an area, didn't have to make one arrest. We gave that community back to the community. We, as a matter of fact, some of those homes were even given to Habitat for Humanities. We were able to get the first house in the United States under Operation Clean House, converted from a drug house to a Habitat home, and put a family in there. It's on Glendale Street. I got to meet Jan Reno. She flew in here and wanted to know, how did you do it? The things that I'm telling now, workable solutions. These things didn't cost any money. It wasn't resource intensive with manpower. Yes, everybody's short of law enforcement, but if you get, we did it with 2 officers, but if you get 3 solid, dedicated officers to community policing concept and get them working closely with the churches, as you and I talked about, with the schools, with the neighborhood association leaders, and we take back our communities. One of the things I like to use is the broken window theory that focuses on, say, if you had a house in a community that went vacant. Generally, the grass will grow, we know, but once you get that first broken window, if you don't fix the rest of the windows, what happens? The rest of the windows will be broken. The neighbors on the left are going to move because it's blight, right? And that starts blight. Criminals love that environment because it sends a subliminal message that the community don't care. So we can come in here and set up and we'll take it. But what we do as community policing, and what we plan to do, is go in and work with the community and take back those neighborhoods. And then when you take something negative, let's say we take a vacant house out, replace it with something like we did around, JC Park. We didn't just tear down the houses on Wood Street, we put Habitat homes there. You put pride back into the community, and then you get law enforcement walking hand in hand with them, not talking to them, but walking with the community using the community policing concept. Then it sends a message to the criminal element that law enforcement and the community work together, but it also sends a message to the youth that someone cares for me besides just the people on the street.
We'll have more with Kevin Lavine when Mississippi Insight continues.
What about on the national level? What should be happening? I mean, you said earlier, I think we were just chatting, and you said everybody should be very concerned about this. I mean, this country should be very concerned about this. Instead, it just becomes a political debate, and it's not about politics.
It's not. It has been, the violence in the country, and I'm just going to say, Jackson, the violence in this country has become a political pond. Okay, they're waiting on midterms to say you're this or you're not that. We are in a crisis now. We need help. Our communities need help now. Our youth need help now. We need the churches to step up. We need the community to step up. But right now they're in fear. They're paralyzed. You wouldn't believe the number of communities I go to and the people are terrified. But it's incumbent upon law enforcement to go back and win that confidence back. And we have to send a clear message that we hear you to the community, law enforcement. We hear you, and we're here to help you, not talk to you or talk at you or just discuss over and over again what's stating the problem. My term is workable solutions, and we have some.
Would you say that increasing the police force is getting more officers to be out there involved in the community, and also to have a facility that is truly a, if we want to call it a detention facility, where you can work with these youth, not just put them in there for 7 days and hold them and release them, and in an environment that's not very good anyway. Are those solutions?
I think it's a start. Manpower from JPD, I will not underscore that. They're hurting. And I consider myself JPD alumnus. It hurts me to see my house the way it is. You know, those officers are being stressed out. And the criminal element know it. So yes, visibility will help. Then you got to look at the methodology of patrol. A lot of people don't understand that you have two different methods of policing. You have what's called a due process model, then you have public order. At this point, we need to be focused on what's called the public order model, what's doing best for the community overall. And early on I was due process, but as I became more academic involved and I see public order isn't a bad methodology, you just have to use the right, what I call stakeholders, DHS, even Mississippi Power and Light, Water Company, all of these social services, use these stakeholders, and you got to call them stakeholders, because when you're talking about fixing the problem in the community, quality of life issues are part of it, and these entities are part of quality of life, and they can improve the quality of life.
Professor Kevin Lavine, thank you so much for being with us.
Straight ahead, we turn to the violence of political extremists and a conspiracy theory that's gained deadly traction among America's far right. We'll be right back. It was a little over 3 weeks ago that yet another mass shooting took the lives of 10 people in Buffalo, New York. The victims slain were black. The 18-year-old suspect in custody, Payne Gendron, is white, and investigators believe racism was a motivating factor in the attack. The young man is a vocal proponent of so-called replacement theory. It is a far-right political ideology that has raised a lot of concern in the civil justice community. We wanted to get a better understanding of what this so-called theory is all about. So Dr. Cassie Miller joins us this morning. She is a researcher and a writer for the Southern Poverty Law Center, and she's well-versed in the rise of extremism and hate crimes across America. Dr. Miller, welcome to Mississippi Insight.
Hi, thank you for having me.
First of all, what is replacement theory and how did it originate?
So the Great Replacement is the idea that white people across the United States and the rest of the Western world are being systematically and deliberately replaced by people who are non-white, predominantly immigrants. And it is a very popular idea, really the defining idea within the white nationalist movement. But it's a very old idea in the United States, the idea that people of color represent an existential threat to the country. But it is a really pressing problem right now, and we've seen it motivate not only the most recent attack in Buffalo, but several other terror attacks across the United States.
Different from early conspiracy theories or paranoias among some white Americans?
I think one of the things that makes this different is unfortunately how pervasive it is. You know, this is an idea that has long motivated the white power movement. They've called it different names, things like white genocide, and now they call it the Great Replacement theory. But the problem is that it's really entered the mainstream. We see in cable news, elected officials using some variation of the Great Replacement theory with pretty alarming regularity. We actually did polling at the Southern Poverty Law Center to see just how pervasive this idea was. And what we found was that almost half of Americans agreed to some extent with the ideas behind the Great Replacement, and that number was significantly higher for Republicans.
Were the Buffalo shootings the first instance of an attack that was apparently influenced by this ideology?
Unfortunately, it wasn't. In the last several years, we've seen 4 different attacks that have been motivated explicitly by the Great Replacement theory, the first one being in Pittsburgh in 2018.
Who's likely to believe in the replacement theory? What are we looking at here?
Unfortunately, this idea has spread online, and a lot of the men who are committing these attacks, it's mostly younger white men who are the ones who are finding this idea online and becoming indoctrinated into a very large community. The people who go and commit these terror attacks, we often think of them as lone wolves, but that's not the right way to think of them because they're part of a much larger political movement that is focused on spreading white supremacy and doing so through the use of violence.
And how long has this been going on for now?
Well, this is an idea that's really deeply embedded in American history, unfortunately. You can look back at the early 20th century and look at eugenics policies or immigration policies that were very much motivated by a similar idea that people of color represented an existential threat to white people in the United States. And now what we're seeing is just a rebranding of that idea, calling it the Great Replacement, and seeing it really proliferate online. The thing that's different now is that we have a social media landscape, a tech landscape, a media landscape in general that helps to spread these ideas, helps to spread misinformation and disinformation and expose a huge number of people to these really dangerous ideas.
What can be done about this, or can anything be done about it?
I think there's a lot that can be done. I think that one of the biggest things that we can ask is that elected officials push back against these ideas. Unfortunately, we've seen some of them actually support the idea of the Great Replacement, and we've seen the damage that it can do. And so we need to push back on those elected officials, and members of political parties need to hold others accountable because those words have really real impact. And I think the other thing we can do is focus on prevention. So often in the United States, what we want to do is focus on the criminal justice system and use punishment and law enforcement. And that only gets at the end results of the radicalization process. What we need to do is try to prevent people from adopting these ideas in the first place. And that can mean things like anti-racist education, and it can also mean training parents and caregivers to be able to recognize when young people are absorbing these dangerous ideas and to be able to step in an effective way.
Where does the fear come from here?
A lot of this fear is manufactured. It's fear of demographic changes, of people losing political power. And that's really what is at the core of the Great Replacement theory. It is a fear that whiteness is under threat.
The SPLC tracks hate groups and crimes across the nation. Here in Mississippi, you list 8 such groups, ranging from the KKK to the New Black Panthers Party and even the American Family Association. Generally speaking, how does your group define hate groups, and are they becoming more common?
Mm-hmm. We define them as a group that vilifies others based on immutable characteristics. So things like race, religion, gender identity, those sorts of things. We counted 733 active hate and extremist groups across the country in 2021. And that's a pretty alarming number, but what we've actually seen is a decline in the number of hate groups over the last several years. And at first that might sound like good news, but really we believe that decline is because a lot of these ideas have become much more mainstream. There isn't as much of a reason to join an extremist group if these ideas are operating in mainstream spaces, are being voiced by people on cable news programs or by politicians. And so that's a really dangerous development.
How can people learn more about hate crimes in America?
I would point them to the resources that we produce at the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I would also direct people towards resources that we have put out with American University. We've worked on a guide for parents and caregivers so that they can recognize the signs of radicalization and when young people are being exposed to extremist thought so that they can respond in an effective way.
And because of what's going on, do you think we're going to have more attacks because of what we're seeing today?
This is a movement that is really feeling like they've had a call to arms. It is violent. It has a long history of violence. And unless we really effectively and aggressively try and tackle it, I think we can unfortunately expect more violence. And we're in a very politically tense atmosphere. We're heading towards an election season. And so I think our elected officials need to take this threat very seriously and act to prevent further violence.
Dr. Cassie Miller, thank you for your time and for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, and we'll be right back. Big thanks to Professor Kevin Lavine and Dr. Cassie Miller for joining the discussion. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.